Night rests along the edge of a frozen river. Mist gathers low over the surface, moving slowly across the water in thin, quiet layers. The current beneath it is steady but subdued, its movement felt more than seen. Along the banks, the trees stand without motion, their branches held still in the cold air. Nothing disturbs the surface. Even the smallest sound carries farther than it should. You remain at a distance, watching the mist drift. Before you settle further into this world, take a moment to subscribe. It helps these quiet stories keep finding their way into the night. And let us know where you're listening from, or which moment stays with you the most. You're listening to Echoes of War. The air is sharp, thin enough that each breath feels contained, visible only for a moment before it disappears. The light has not fully arrived. It lingers somewhere beyond the horizon, leaving the river suspended between darkness and day. Further away, beyond the trees, the city waits. Somewhere within the city, a building remains awake. Its windows are dim, the glass clouded by cold from the inside as much as the outside. The walls hold a different kind of stillness here, not the stillness of abandonment, but of sustained effort. Behind those walls, movement continues in small, careful patterns. Doors open and close without force. Footsteps pass along corridors with measured weight, each step placed deliberately, as if sound itself must be conserved. Light exists in narrow pools, gathered beneath hanging bulbs that flicker with a tired consistency, illuminating only what is necessary and leaving the rest to shadow. She moves through one of these corridors without hurry. Her coat hangs loosely around her, heavier than it once felt, its fabric stiff at the edges where cold has settled into it. Beneath it, her body carries the quiet strain of days that have not properly ended, only folded into one another. Her hands are steady, but the steadiness is maintained, not given. It requires attention, the way one holds a fragile object without letting it slip. The air she breathes is thin and dry, carrying the faint smell of metal, of cloth, of something that lingers between antiseptic and decay. It is a smell that does not belong to a single moment. It accumulates, layer by layer, until it becomes part of the building itself. You watch her pass a doorway where the light spills slightly wider, revealing the edge of a room beyond. Inside, shapes lie arranged in close proximity. Blankets pulled tight. Faces partially visible. The outlines of bodies that do not move unless necessary. The room is not silent, but the sounds it holds are restrained. A breath drawn carefully. A shift of fabric. A low murmur that never rises into conversation. There is no urgency in the noise, not because urgency is absent, but because it has already been absorbed into the rhythm of the place. What once might have caused alarm now settles into expectation. She does not stop at the doorway. There are too many rooms to stop at each one, too many moments that would require her full attention if she allowed herself to linger. Instead, she carries the awareness with her, letting it remain at the edges of her perception as she continues forward. Her steps follow a path she no longer needs to think about. The corridor bends slightly, and her body adjusts without hesitation, guided by repetition rather than decision. The building has been learned not as a structure, but as a sequence of movements, each turn and threshold already held somewhere in her muscles. Outside, the cold continues to press inward. Inside, something else presses outward. It is not heat, not in the way it used to exist. It is the presence of bodies, of effort, of time being spent continuously without clear division. The building breathes in a different rhythm from the city around it. Where the streets have slowed, this place continues, held together by small acts repeated again and again. A door opened, a bandage adjusted, a hand steadied. Each action is minor in isolation. Together, They form a structure as real as the walls themselves. She reaches another doorway and pauses, just briefly. Not to rest. Not to decide. Only to adjust her grip on what she carries, to feel the weight settle more evenly in her hands. The pause is small enough that it might go unnoticed if you were not already watching closely. Then she moves again, stepping into the room beyond, where the light is slightly stronger and the air slightly thicker, as if the space itself holds more of what has already happened within it. You remain at the threshold for a moment longer, looking in. There is no clear beginning here, only continuation. The room holds its own kind of gravity. Light gathers unevenly across the surfaces within it, catching on metal edges and the pale lines of fabric stretched across narrow beds. Shadows rest between them, not deep enough to conceal, but enough to soften the outlines of what lies there. The air feels denser, as if it has been breathed too many times without fully leaving. It carries warmth, but not comfort, only the residual presence of bodies held close together in a space that was not meant to hold so many. Each surface seems to remember touch, the worn edge of a table, the indentation in a pillow, the faint imprint of hands that have pressed down again and again. She moves through the room with a quiet familiarity. Her steps do not disturb the stillness so much as become part of it. There is a sequence to her movement that no longer requires thought, an order shaped not by instruction, but by repetition. She approaches one bed, then another, her hands adjusting small details that would be easy to overlook. A blanket drawn slightly higher, a cloth repositioned beneath a resting arm, a glance held for a moment longer than the others, not because something has changed, but because something might. Her attention moves constantly, but never quickly. It settles, lifts, and settles again, like breath moving through the body. You notice how little is said. Voices exist, but they do not travel far. Words are kept close, shaped carefully so they do not carry beyond what is necessary. When someone speaks, it is not to fill silence, but to meet a need that cannot be met otherwise. The rest of the time, communication happens through smaller gestures. A hand placed lightly on a shoulder, a nod that acknowledges presence without interrupting it. Even the exchange of objects, cloth, instruments, water, occurs without excess movement, as if every action has been refined to its simplest form. Time does not announce itself here. There are no clear markers to separate 1 hour from the next. Light does not shift enough to guide the eye. The rhythm of the room replaces the rhythm of the day. Movement slows, then resumes. Breathing deepens, then becomes shallow. The same actions repeat, not because nothing changes, but because change happens gradually, almost imperceptibly. You begin to understand that time is not passing in the usual way. It is accumulating, settling into the space like the cold outside, layering itself until it becomes difficult to distinguish one moment from another. She reaches the end of the row and turns. The motion is smooth, practiced. There is no hesitation, no pause to consider what comes next. The next step is already known. Her body carries it forward without instruction. You see how the work has shaped her movement, how each action follows the last with quiet precision. There is no wasted effort, no excess gesture. Even fatigue, when it appears, is contained within the boundaries of what must be done. It does not interrupt the sequence. It moves alongside it. Beyond the room, the corridor waits in the same dim light. The building extends outward in all directions, holding more rooms like this one, each with its own quiet variations. Some will be more crowded. Some will be darker. Some will carry a different balance of sound. But the pattern remains. Movement, adjustment, observation. The repetition is not accidental. It is what allows the work to continue without breaking under its own weight. Each small action reinforces the next, forming a continuity that replaces the need for certainty. Outside, the city remains under snow. The streets do not know what is happening here, just as this room does not know the full shape of the city beyond its walls. Each exists within its own boundaries, connected only by the movement of people who pass between them. But even that movement has slowed, narrowed to what is necessary. The distance between outside and inside has grown, not in space, but in experience. What happens here belongs to a different rhythm, one that does not follow the usual patterns of day and night, of work and rest. You begin to sense that this place is not temporary, not in the way a moment is temporary, passing cleanly into what follows. This is a continuation without a clear end, a condition that extends forward without revealing where it might conclude. The work does not build toward resolution. It sustains itself, one action at a time, held together by the people who remain within it. There is no single point where it begins or ends, only a constant return to what must be done. She pauses again, briefly, near the center of the room. Her hand rests on the edge of a bed, not pressing, just making contact. The gesture is small, almost indistinguishable from the others, but it lingers slightly longer. Then it lifts, and she moves on, continuing the sequence that has already been set in motion. The room absorbs the pause without changing. The rhythm holds. You remain where you are, watching the movement continue. There is no announcement, no declaration, only the quiet understanding that this is how it is, and how it will remain, for longer than anyone can easily measure. The first hours without end. Morning arrives, but it does not announce itself. The light shifts only slightly, a thin dilution of darkness rather than a clear transition into day. It moves across the windows in a pale, uncertain way, touching the frost that has formed along the inside edges of the glass. The frost patterns hold their shape, delicate and intricate, as if they belong to another world entirely, one where time still moves with intention. Inside the room, the change is barely noticed. The work continues in the same rhythm, uninterrupted by the subtle movement of light that would once have marked the beginning of a new day. She has already been awake for hours, or perhaps she has not slept at all. The distinction no longer carries the same meaning. Sleep, when it comes, is brief and shallow, more like a pause in motion than a true separation from it. Her body does not reset. It continues, picking up where it left off, as if the night never fully ended. The lines between shifts have softened, dissolved into something continuous. Time is no longer divided into manageable portions. It stretches, unbroken, across the hours. You watch her move toward a table near the center of the room. On its surface, objects are arranged with careful precision, cloth folded into narrow stacks, instruments placed in a sequence that allows them to be reached without hesitation. A container of water that has begun to cool, its surface still enough to reflect the dim light above it. Nothing is wasted here, not space, not motion, not attention. Each item has been placed where it will be needed next, not because someone planned it that way once, but because it has been learned through repetition. The arrangement is the result of many small corrections, each one refining the process until it holds together without thought. She reaches for a piece of cloth and pauses for a fraction of a second, not in uncertainty, but in recognition. The cloth is thinner than it should be. It has been used before, cleaned as thoroughly as possible, and folded again into service. Its edges are worn. The fibers no longer hold the same strength. Still, it will be used. There is no alternative waiting to replace it. Her fingers adjust their grip slightly, accounting for the change, and then she turns toward the nearest bed. The man lying there does not move. His breathing is present, but faint, rising and falling in a rhythm that seems detached from the rest of the room. His face is partially shadowed, the contours softened by the dimness. What can be seen carries the marks of strain, skin drawn tighter than it should be, lips dry, eyes closed not in rest, but in withdrawal. The blanket covering him is pulled carefully into place, not to provide warmth alone, but to maintain a boundary between his body and the air around it. She works without urgency, but not without purpose. Her hands move with a steady precision, adjusting the cloth, checking what can be checked, noting what cannot be changed. There is no dramatic gesture, no sudden shift in movement. Everything unfolds in small increments, each action following the last with quiet consistency. The work is not about transformation. It is about maintenance. Holding something in place long enough for it to continue, even if only briefly. You begin to notice the pattern repeating across the room. Each bed holds a variation of the same condition. Some bodies are more responsive, shifting slightly as they are touched. Others remain still, their presence defined only by the subtle movement of breath. The differences matter, but they do not alter the overall rhythm. The work remains the same. Approach, observe, adjust, move on. The sequence repeats, not because it is sufficient, but because it is what can be sustained. From somewhere beyond the room, a sound carries through the corridor. It is not loud, but it is distinct enough to register. The movement of something being transported. A stretcher, perhaps. The sound of wood or metal passing over a surface not entirely smooth. It does not interrupt the work inside the room. It becomes part of the background, another layer added to the environment. No one looks toward the door. No one waits for what might come through it. The expectation is already present. There will be more. She finishes at the bedside and steps back. The motion is small, controlled. Her hands lower, then rise again as she turns toward the next bed. There is no pause to evaluate what has just been done. The result will reveal itself over time, or it will not. Her role is not to determine outcomes. It is to continue the process, to apply the same attention to each place where it is needed. You feel the weight of repetition settling into the room. It is not heavy in a sudden way. It accumulates slowly, built from the layering of identical actions carried out across different bodies, different moments, all held within the same confined space. The work does not expand outward. It circles within itself, reinforcing the pattern that allows it to continue. There is no clear beginning to this cycle, and no visible end. The light at the window grows slightly stronger, not enough to change the room, but enough to outline the shapes more clearly. Edges become more defined. The distance between objects becomes easier to see. Still, the atmosphere remains unchanged. The day, if it can be called that, does not bring relief. It reveals what is already there, nothing more. She reaches the far side of the room and turns again. The movement is the same as before. Practiced, unremarkable, necessary. You begin to understand that this is how the hours will unfold, not as separate moments, but as a continuous surface, stretched across time without interruption. The men carrying the stretcher do not speak. Their movements are coordinated without instruction, shaped by repetition rather than command. They guide the stretcher into the space between two beds where a place has already been prepared, not because it was empty, but because something else has been moved to make room. The adjustment is subtle, a shift of position, a narrowing of space. The room does not expand to accommodate what arrives. It compresses. She steps forward to meet them. There is no urgency in her pace, but there is no delay either. Her hands reach the edge of the stretcher as it is lowered, steadying it not because it wavers, but because that is how it is always done. It unfolds immediately, as if it had already been in progress before the stretcher crossed the threshold. Around her, the room absorbs the addition without disruption. No one stops. No one turns fully toward the new arrival. Attention shifts, but only within the limits of what can be sustained. The pattern holds. The work continues. The presence of one more body does not alter the rhythm. It reinforces it. The expectation that there will always be another has already been accepted. The cold lingers near the doorway. It does not move far into the room, held back by the density of air within. But it remains there, a thin line between outside and inside, marking the passage that has just occurred. You can feel the difference even without stepping closer. It is not only temperature. It is the reminder of distance, of the city beyond, of the space between where this body was and where it now rests. She completes the initial adjustments and steps back. Again, the motion is controlled, contained. There is no visible reaction, no outward sign that this arrival is different from the others. The work does not allow for that kind of distinction. Each case is met with the same sequence, the same measured attention. The individuality of the moment exists, but it is held within a structure that does not change. You begin to notice how the room organizes itself around limitation. There is not enough space, not enough light, not enough material. Her body adjusts its path, incorporating the new need into the existing sequence. There is no moment of decision, only continuation. She moves to the next bed, and then the next, her steps following the same measured pattern. The work expands to include what has just arrived, not by adding something new, but by extending what already exists. The room does not grow more complex. It grows more full. You feel the sense of time shifting again, not forward, but deeper, as if each repetition presses further into the same moment, layering it until it becomes something thicker, more difficult to separate into parts. The arrival of the stretcher does not mark a new phase. It confirms the one that is already underway. They sustain themselves, one action at a time, held together by the quiet persistence of those who remain within them. And as the room continues, unchanged in its pattern, you begin to see that what has just happened is not an interruption. It is the pattern itself. Rooms that do not empty. The corridor extends farther than it first appears. Its length is not measured by distance alone, but by repetition. Doorways line the walls at regular intervals, each one opening into a room that holds a variation of the same condition. Not faster, not slower, but aligned with the space she now moves through. Her steps fall in a pattern that matches the corridor's length, the intervals between them shaped by the distance between doorways, the placement of objects along the walls, the subtle variations in the floor beneath her feet. The movement is continuous, guided by an understanding that no longer requires conscious thought. From ahead, another figure approaches. Their form emerges gradually from the dimness, defined first by motion, then by shape. They move with the same controlled precision, their path aligned with the center of the corridor. As they draw closer, there is no exchange of words, no interruption of movement. A slight shift to the side allows both to pass without contact. The moment is brief, but complete. Recognition occurs without acknowledgement. You notice how the corridor holds these encounters. They do not disrupt the flow. They are absorbed into it, becoming part of the ongoing pattern of movement that defines the space. Each person moves within the same system, their actions aligned by necessity rather than coordination. The result is a quiet continuity, a shared rhythm that persists without being spoken. She reaches a doorway where the light spills more fully into the hall. The difference is subtle, but noticeable. The room beyond holds a stronger presence, its interior more clearly defined from the threshold. Her path shifts to accommodate the tighter arrangement, her steps placed with precision to avoid contact with the edges of beds, the objects positioned along the floor, the presence of others moving within the same limited space. The sequence continues, unchanged in its structure, adapted only in its execution. You remain at the doorway, observing the room as it reveals itself. There is no sense that this place will empty, no indication that the number of bodies within it will decrease, or that the space will return to what it once was. Instead, it holds a steady state, maintained not by stability, but by constant adjustment. The room exists as it is because the work continues to shape it, moment by moment, action by action. She reaches the first bed and begins again. The same sequence, the same measured attention. The corridor, the rooms, the movement between them, all of it forms a structure that does not expand or resolve. It continues. The space between the beds is just wide enough for movement. It requires attention, but not hesitation. Her steps adjust to the narrow passage, guided by memory rather than sight. She does not look down to place her feet. The path has already been learned, traced so many times that it exists somewhere beneath thought. Each turn of her body accounts for what surrounds her: the edge of a frame, the position of a stool, the quiet presence of another person moving through the same confined space. The air holds a different weight here. It is warmer, but not in a way that comforts. The warmth gathers without dispersing, settling low and lingering close to the surfaces it touches. It carries the layered presence of breath, of cloth, of something that does not fully leave once it has entered. You can sense how long it has remained, how little it has changed despite the constant movement within it. The room does not refresh itself. It accumulates. She reaches the first bed and leans slightly forward. The figure lying there responds with a small shift, the movement delayed, as if it has traveled a longer distance than it should. Her hand rests briefly near the shoulder, not pressing, only marking the point of contact. It is enough to confirm presence, to register that something within the body still answers, even if slowly. She adjusts the blanket, smoothing it where it has gathered, then moves her hand away with the same care. You notice how the work adapts without altering its form. The same sequence unfolds, but each step accommodates the condition it meets. Some movements are shorter. Some require more attention. Some end sooner than others. Yet the pattern remains intact, holding the variation within it rather than changing to meet it. This is how the work continues without breaking. It does not depend on uniformity. It absorbs difference. Further into the room, another figure stands at the edge of a bed. Their posture mirrors her own, the angle of the body aligned with the task at hand. There is no coordination between them, no shared signal. And yet, their movements do not conflict. Each occupies a portion of the space that allows the other to continue. The alignment is not planned. It is the result of repetition, of many small adjustments made over time until the system holds without instruction. She moves past them without pause. There is a brief narrowing of space as their paths intersect, a slight shift of position to allow both to continue. No words are exchanged. None are needed. The interaction is complete in the movement itself. Then she is beyond them, already engaged with the next place where her attention is required. The room does not offer a clear center. There is no single point from which everything can be seen or understood. Instead, it exists as a series of overlapping fields, each defined by the reach of someone's hands, the span of their attention, the limits of what they can hold at once. To move through it is to pass between these fields, entering and leaving them without fully containing any one of them. You begin to feel how the space resists completion. No matter where you look, there is always more beyond it. Another bed, another movement, another small adjustment taking place just outside the edge of your view. The room cannot be finished because it does not move toward an end. It maintains itself through continuation, through the steady repetition of actions that do not resolve, only persist. She reaches the far side and turns again. The motion is unchanged, but the space she moves into now carries a slightly different balance. The light falls at a different angle. The air feels marginally cooler. The bodies arranged here are positioned with a bit more distance between them, though not enough to alter the overall density. These variations are subtle, but they are enough to require adjustment. Her path shifts accordingly, her steps aligning with the new arrangement without interrupting the sequence. From somewhere behind you, the corridor breathes quietly. A door opens, then closes. The sound travels only a short distance before settling into the background. You realize that the boundary between room and hallway is not fixed. It allows movement, but it does not allow separation. What happens in one space carries into the next, not as a direct continuation, but as a shared condition. She pauses at the edge of another bed. This time, the stillness is more pronounced. The body before her does not respond in the same way as the others. There is no visible shift, no change in the rhythm of breath. Her hand hovers for a moment, then lowers gently to rest near the surface. The gesture is the same as before, but it holds slightly longer, as if allowing time to confirm what is already understood. There is no visible reaction. She does not change her expression. She does not call attention to the moment. Instead, her hand lifts, and she adjusts the blanket with the same care she has shown throughout the room. The action does not differ. It follows the established sequence, maintaining the structure even as the condition within it has shifted. You feel the absence register without announcement. It does not interrupt the room. It does not alter the movement around it. It becomes part of the environment, another state held within the same pattern of attention and response. The room does not stop to acknowledge it. It continues, absorbing the change without breaking. She steps back and turns. The next movement is already waiting. You begin to understand that the rooms do not empty because they are not defined by what leaves them. They are defined by what remains. And what remains is always enough to continue. Materials that return. The space between the beds is just wide enough for movement. It requires attention, but not hesitation. Her steps adjust to the narrow passage, guided by memory rather than sight. She does not look down to place her feet. The path has already been learned, traced so many times that it exists somewhere beneath thought. Each turn of her body accounts for what surrounds her: the edge of a frame, the position of a stool, the quiet presence of another person moving through the same confined space. The air holds a different weight here. It is warmer, but not in a way that comforts. The warmth gathers without dispersing, settling low and lingering close to the surfaces it touches. It carries the layered presence of breath, of cloth, of something that does not fully leave once it has entered. You can sense how long it has remained, how little it has changed despite the constant movement within it. The room does not refresh itself. It accumulates. She reaches the first bed and leans slightly forward. The figure lying there responds with a small shift, the movement delayed, as if it has traveled a longer distance than it should. Her hand rests briefly near the shoulder, not pressing, only marking the point of contact. It is enough to confirm presence, to register that something within the body still answers, even if slowly. She adjusts the blanket, smoothing it where it has gathered, then moves her hand away with the same care. You notice how the work adapts without altering its form. The same sequence unfolds, but each step accommodates the condition it meets. Some movements are shorter. Some require more attention. Some end sooner than others. Yet the pattern remains intact, holding the variation within it rather than changing to meet it. This is how the work continues without breaking. It does not depend on uniformity. It absorbs difference. Further into the room, another figure stands at the edge of a bed. Their posture mirrors her own, the angle of the body aligned with the task at hand. There is no coordination between them, no shared signal. And yet, their movements do not conflict. Each occupies a portion of the space that allows the other to continue. The alignment is not planned. It is the result of repetition, of many small adjustments made over time until the system holds without instruction. She moves past them without pause. There is a brief narrowing of space as their paths intersect, a slight shift of position to allow both to continue. No words are exchanged. None are needed. The interaction is complete in the movement itself. Then she is beyond them, already engaged with the next place where her attention is required. The room does not offer a clear center. There is no single point from which everything can be seen or understood. Instead, it exists as a series of overlapping fields, each defined by the reach of someone's hands, the span of their attention, the limits of what they can hold at once. To move through it is to pass between these fields, entering and leaving them without fully containing any one of them. You begin to feel how the space resists completion. No matter where you look, there is always more beyond it. Another bed, another movement, another small adjustment taking place just outside the edge of your view. The room cannot be finished because it does not move toward an end. It maintains itself through continuation, through the steady repetition of actions that do not resolve, only persist. She reaches the far side and turns again. The motion is unchanged, but the space she moves into now carries a slightly different balance. The light falls at a different angle. The air feels marginally cooler. The bodies arranged here are positioned with a bit more distance between them, though not enough to alter the overall density. These variations are subtle, but they are enough to require adjustment. Her path shifts accordingly, her steps aligning with the new arrangement without interrupting the sequence. From somewhere behind you, the corridor breathes quietly. A door opens, then closes. The sound travels only a short distance before settling into the background. You realize that the boundary between room and hallway is not fixed. It allows movement, but it does not allow separation. What happens in one space carries into the next, not as a direct continuation, but as a shared condition. She pauses at the edge of another bed. This time, the stillness is more pronounced. The body before her does not respond in the same way as the others. There is no visible shift, no change in the rhythm of breath. Her hand hovers for a moment, then lowers gently to rest near the surface. The gesture is the same as before, but it holds slightly longer, as if allowing time to confirm what is already understood. There is no visible reaction. She does not change her expression. She does not call attention to the moment. Instead, her hand lifts, and she adjusts the blanket with the same care she has shown throughout the room. The action does not differ. It follows the established sequence, maintaining the structure even as the condition within it has shifted. You feel the absence register without announcement. It does not interrupt the room. It does not alter the movement around it. It becomes part of the environment, another state held within the same pattern of attention and response. The room does not stop to acknowledge it. It continues, absorbing the change without breaking. She steps back and turns. The next movement is already waiting. You begin to understand that the rooms do not empty because they are not defined by what leaves them. They are defined by what remains. And what remains is always enough to continue. Pause here. Confirm when ready for Chapter 3, Part A. Proceed. Chapter 3. Materials that return. Part A. The table near the window holds what the room cannot replace. Its surface is narrow, worn along the edges where hands have rested too often and too long. The wood has darkened unevenly, absorbing what has been placed upon it over time. Light reaches it more clearly than other parts of the room, not because it is brighter there, but because the window allows a thinner distance between surface and sky. The glass is clouded, but still enough passes through to outline the objects arranged across the table in careful order. She approaches it with the same measured pace. There is no sense of transition between one task and the next. The movement toward the table is part of the same sequence that guided her through the beds. Her hands lower slightly as she nears it, adjusting not in intention, but in preparation. The work here requires a different kind of contact, less with the body, more with the material that will return to it. You see how little there is. Cloth, folded into stacks that do not match in size or texture. Some pieces are thin, their edges softened by repeated use. Others are thicker, but fewer in number, set aside as if their weight must be preserved for moments not yet known. A small container holds water that has lost its clarity, its surface reflecting the dim light with a muted sheen. Nearby, instruments lie arranged in a line that suggests order, though each bears the marks of wear, handles dulled, edges no longer precise. She reaches for a piece of cloth and unfolds it. The motion is slow, deliberate, as if the act of opening it reveals not only its shape, but its history. The fibers stretch slightly, resisting in places where they have weakened. She smooths it with her fingers, pressing lightly along its surface, checking what remains of its integrity. There is no expectation that it will be as it once was, only an assessment of what it can still become. You notice how the table holds a different kind of attention. In the beds, the work is continuous, shaped by the presence of bodies that demand response. Here, the pace shifts, not to rest, but to prepare. The actions are smaller, more contained, each one focused on extending the life of what is already worn. Nothing is discarded. There is no place for that. Everything returns, altered, diminished, but still necessary. She dips the cloth into the water. The surface breaks quietly, the movement contained within the boundaries of the container. The water does not ripple far. It absorbs the motion, then settles again, holding the cloth as it is lifted and pressed gently between her hands. Excess is removed, not wasted. The cloth is reshaped, made ready for the next use, though it will not resemble what it once was. From the edge of the table, another set of hands reaches into view. They move with the same familiarity, selecting an instrument, adjusting its position, returning it to the sequence. There is no exchange of words. The coordination exists without acknowledgement, each person working within the same limited field, aware of the other's presence without needing to confirm it. The table becomes a shared point, a place where movements intersect without interruption. You begin to see how the materials carry time within them. Each object holds the memory of its previous use. The cloth that is now being prepared has already served once, perhaps many times. The instrument that rests beside it has been handled again and again, its surface shaped by the repetition of contact. Nothing here is new. Everything bears the trace of what has come before. She finishes preparing the cloth and sets it aside, not at random, but in a position that aligns with the sequence she will follow next. The placement is precise, though it appears simple. It allows her to reach for it without hesitation when the moment comes. The table is not organized for appearance. It is arranged for continuity. The light at the window shifts slightly. It does not brighten, but it changes in quality, softening the edges of what it touches. The frost along the glass has thickened, its patterns more pronounced, catching the light in small, irregular lines. Beyond it, the outside remains indistinct, a pale suggestion of space that does not fully enter the room. The table becomes a point of return, a place where the cycle is renewed without ever beginning again. She turns from the table, the prepared cloth in her hand. The movement carries her back toward the beds, toward the continuation of what has already been set in motion. There is no shift in expression, no visible acknowledgement of the transition. The work remains the same, even as its form changes. You remain by the table for a moment longer. The objects rest where they have been placed, holding their quiet arrangement. Nothing here suggests completion, only return. The table remains behind her, but its presence continues in her hands. The cloth she carries holds the coolness of the water, though it begins to fade as it meets the warmer air of the room. Its weight is slight, yet it requires care, the edges kept aligned so that it can be used without adjustment once she reaches the bedside. The preparation has already shaped the next movement. What was done at the table now extends forward, carried into the sequence without interruption. She steps back into the narrow passage between the beds. The space receives her without change. The same careful navigation, the same measured placement of each step. The room does not pause to accommodate her return. It continues as it was, the pattern holding steady as she re-enters it. Her path follows the line she has already traced, her body adjusting to the familiar constraints without hesitation. You notice how the cloth changes as it is used. It no longer belongs to the table. It becomes part of the work at the bedside, shaped by contact, by pressure, by the small movements of her hands as they guide it into place. The fibers absorb what they meet, altering their texture, their color, their weight. The transformation is gradual, but constant. What was prepared only moments ago begins to move toward its next return. She leans slightly forward and begins the sequence again. The cloth is placed, adjusted, held for a moment longer than it might have been elsewhere. Her hands remain steady, though the effort to maintain that steadiness is present in the slight tension of her fingers, in the controlled pace of her movement. There is no excess motion. Each action is contained within the limits of what is necessary, guided by the same quiet precision that has shaped every step before it. From the far side of the room, another movement echoes the same pattern. A different set of hands lifts a piece of cloth, adjusts it, sets it aside. The sequence repeats, not in exact synchrony, but in alignment. The room becomes a field of mirrored actions, each one reinforcing the others without direct coordination. The repetition does not create monotony. The cloth folds slightly as it is lifted, its structure already changed by the contact it has held. She does not discard it. There is no place for that. Instead, she gathers it in her hand, preparing it for its return to the table, where it will be reshaped once more. The path back is the same as before. Her steps retrace the narrow passage, her body aligning with the space as if it has never left it. The movement does not require adjustment. It continues, uninterrupted, as part of the same sequence that has been unfolding since the beginning of the day, or the night, or whatever lies between them. At the table, the cloth is placed among the others. not randomly, but within an order that reflects its current state. It joins the stack of pieces that have already been used, their textures and colors marking the stage they have reached within the cycle. The arrangement is not static. It shifts constantly, each addition altering the balance, each removal changing what remains. You notice how the water has changed. It is darker now, its surface less reflective, holding within it the accumulation of what has been washed into it. Still, it will be used again. There is no replacement waiting. The cycle continues, even as the materials that sustain it move further from what they once were. She reaches for another piece of cloth. The sequence begins again. The same unfolding, the same preparation, the same movement toward the beds. Each iteration is slightly different, shaped by the condition of the material, by the needs of the moment, by the limits of what can be done. Yet the structure holds. It does not collapse under variation. It absorbs it. You begin to understand that nothing here is temporary in the way it once was. Objects do not pass through the space and leave. They remain, returning again and again, each time altered, each time carrying more of what has been placed upon them. The table becomes a point of convergence, a place where the past and the present meet in the form of material that continues to serve. She turns once more, the newly prepared cloth in her hand. The movement is unchanged. The room receives her again. And the cycle continues, not because it is sufficient, but because it cannot stop. Bodies that continue working. The body that moves through the room is not separate from it. It has been shaped by the same repetition that defines the space, its movements refined by necessity until they follow a path that no longer requires instruction. Each step, each gesture, each moment of stillness belongs to a sequence that has been practiced beyond memory. What remains is not the effort of learning, but the effort of continuing. She pauses briefly near the edge of a bed, not to rest, but because the movement requires it. Her hand steadies against the frame, fingers resting lightly on the worn surface. The contact is small, almost incidental, yet it holds a quiet weight. You can see how the body negotiates with itself in these moments, how it measures what remains against what is required. The pause does not interrupt the work. It allows it to continue. Her breath is visible in the air, not as a strong exhale, but as a faint presence, a thin cloud that forms and dissolves quickly. The room is warmer than the corridor, but the cold has not fully withdrawn. It lingers in the edges, in the surfaces that do not hold heat for long. Her breath marks the space briefly, then disappears, leaving no trace beyond the rhythm it maintains. You begin to notice the weight carried in her movement. It is not the weight of what she holds in her hands, but the weight of continuation. The body does not move freely. It moves with intention, each action measured against the energy it requires. There is no excess. Even the smallest gesture is shaped by the need to preserve what remains of strength. She straightens slightly and continues. The motion is controlled, but not effortless. There is a subtle delay between intention and action, a fraction of time that did not exist before. It is not enough to disrupt the sequence, but it is enough to be felt. The body responds, adjusts, compensates. The work continues, carried forward by a system that does not depend on ease. Across the room, another figure leans against the wall. Their posture mirrors the same negotiation. The shoulders rest for a moment longer than movement would require, the head angled slightly downward, not in sleep, but in a brief suspension of motion. Then, without announcement, they shift, returning to the sequence as if the pause had not occurred. You see how these moments are contained. They do not expand into rest. They do not become interruption. They remain within the boundaries of the work, small adjustments that allow the body to continue without fully stopping. The room does not accommodate rest. Each gesture is both a task and a measure of what remains possible. From the far side of the room, a slight misalignment draws your attention. A hand moves to adjust a cloth, but the motion falters briefly, the placement not as precise as before. The correction follows immediately, the sequence restored without pause. The deviation is small, almost imperceptible, yet it marks a change. The body is no longer responding with the same certainty. It compensates, but the effort to do so is present. She does not look toward it. Her focus remains where it is needed, her movements aligned with the immediate task. The room does not allow for attention to drift beyond what can be sustained. Each person holds their portion of the work, contained within the limits of their reach. The light shifts slightly, though it does not bring clarity. It moves across the surfaces, altering the way edges are defined, the way shadows settle between objects. The change is subtle, but it affects the perception of space. Distances seem slightly different, the boundaries between forms less certain. The body adjusts to this as well, relying less on sight, more on memory, on the familiarity of movement that has been established over time. She steps back and turns. The motion is the same as before, but it carries a different weight. The continuity remains, but it is sustained through effort rather than ease. The body does not question the sequence. It follows it, held in place by the necessity that defines every action within the room. You begin to feel how the work continues through the body, not despite it. The strain does not stop the movement. It becomes part of it. The strain does not gather in one place. It distributes itself across the body, settling into different areas at different times, shifting as the work continues. What begins in the hands moves into the wrists, then into the shoulders, then lower, where the weight of standing begins to press into the legs. There is no single point where it can be addressed. It must be carried as a whole, adjusted moment by moment as each part of the body takes on what the others can no longer hold. She moves toward the center of the room again. The path is unchanged, but the way it is traveled reveals more of what is being sustained. Her steps remain steady, yet there is a slight shortening in their length, a subtle conservation of motion that reduces the effort required to cross the same distance. The change is not visible unless you have been watching closely. It does not alter the sequence. It allows it to continue. You notice how her hands remain precise. Even as the rest of the body adjusts, the hands maintain their function with careful discipline. They do not tremble openly. They do not lose their place within the sequence. The control is deliberate, held in place by a tension that does not relax. The effort required to maintain that control is not expressed outwardly. It is contained, absorbed into the movement itself. She reaches for an object and lifts it. The motion is smooth, but it carries a slight delay, a fraction of time where the body gathers itself before completing the action. The object is positioned, adjusted, set into place with the same care as before. The sequence holds, even as the time within it begins to stretch. From near the doorway, a quiet sound emerges. It is not distinct enough to identify immediately, but it carries a different quality from the rest of the room. A breath drawn more sharply, a shift that does not settle as quickly. The sound does not travel far. It remains close to where it began, contained within a small area of space. She does not turn toward it at once. Her attention remains with the task in front of her, completing the sequence before allowing it to move elsewhere. When she does shift her gaze, it is brief, measured, just enough to register the change without breaking the rhythm of her movement. The information is taken in, held, and then incorporated into what comes next. You begin to see how attention itself becomes limited. It cannot expand to hold everything at once. It must move, like the body, from one point to another, carrying only what is necessary, leaving the rest to remain where it is until it can be returned to. This movement of attention follows the same pattern as the physical work, guided by the same constraints. She steps toward the doorway, her path adjusting slightly to account for the narrower space. The body that has been working within the room now transitions again, not into rest, but into another extension of the same sequence. The corridor receives her as before, the air shifting subtly as she crosses the threshold. The change in space does not relieve the strain. It redistributes it. In the corridor, the sound becomes clearer. Another figure stands near the wall, their posture slightly altered from the others you have seen. One hand rests against the surface, the other held close to the body. Their breathing is more visible, each exhale marking the air with a faint, uneven rhythm. The pause they occupy is longer than the brief intervals you have observed before. She approaches without urgency. Her steps remain aligned with the same measured pace, her movement neither accelerating nor slowing in response to what she sees. When she reaches them, her presence does not interrupt their stillness. It joins it briefly, before guiding it back into motion. Her hand lifts, not to command, but to steady. The contact is light, almost indistinguishable from the other gestures that have filled the room. It rests for a moment, then withdraws. The figure shifts slightly, their posture adjusting, their breath finding a more even rhythm. There is no exchange of words. The interaction is complete in the movement itself. You notice how the body supports the body, not through intervention that changes the course of events, but through small adjustments that allow continuation. The system does not provide relief. It provides just enough stability to keep the sequence intact. She turns back toward the room. The movement is immediate, the transition seamless. The pause in the corridor does not extend. It does not become rest. It remains what it was, a moment within the sequence that allows the sequence to continue. As she steps through the doorway, the room receives her again. Nothing has changed. The pattern holds. The bodies within it continue, not because they are unaffected, but because they have become part of the structure that sustains the work. You begin to understand that endurance here is not a quality that exists separately from action. It is the action, and as long as the movement continues, the body will continue with it. Time without markers. Time does not move forward in a way that can be followed. It settles instead, spreading across the room without clear direction, like a thin layer of dust that gathers without being seen. There are no boundaries to separate 1 hour from the next, no signal that something has ended and something else has begun. The light remains too constant to guide the eye. The work remains too continuous to allow for pause. What exists is a surface of moments that do not divide, only accumulate. She moves within this surface without reference. Her actions follow the same sequence, but they are no longer tied to a sense of progression. There is no beginning to what she does, and no point at which it resolves. Each movement leads to the next, not because it advances something, but because it sustains what is already present. The sequence holds, repeating itself without marking its own repetition. You begin to lose track of how long you have been watching, not because nothing has changed, but because change no longer presents itself in a way that can be measured. The same actions occur, but each carries slight variation, enough to alter the moment, but not enough to define it as separate from what came before. The room exists in a continuous state, where difference is absorbed rather than highlighted. At the window, the light shifts again. It grows marginally brighter, then dims, then returns to something in between. The change is gradual, almost imperceptible, and it does not align with the rhythm of the work inside the room. The two exist alongside each other without coordination. The outside follows its own pattern. Inside, the pattern does not follow anything beyond itself. She pauses near the table, her hand resting briefly on its surface. The contact is light, not an attempt to hold herself up, but a moment of alignment between body and object. The pause does not extend. It does not become rest. It marks a point within the sequence, then dissolves as she lifts her hand and continues. You notice how the body no longer seeks orientation. There is no glance toward the window to measure the day, no adjustment in pace that corresponds to an external cycle. The work defines the rhythm. It replaces the need for markers, creating a structure that exists entirely within the boundaries of the room. The outside becomes distant, not in space, but in relevance. From the far side of the room, a small change occurs. A figure shifts more noticeably than before, the movement carrying a slight urgency that does not align with the surrounding pace. The adjustment is contained quickly, brought back into the existing rhythm, but it leaves a trace, a brief disturbance that does not resolve into anything larger. She registers it without turning fully. Her attention moves just enough to incorporate the change, then returns to the task in front of her. There is no space to follow the disturbance beyond what is necessary. It is absorbed, like everything else, into the continuity of the work. You begin to sense how time thickens here. It does not pass. It gathers. Each repetition adds to what is already present, layering the moment until it becomes dense, difficult to separate into parts. The room holds this accumulation, not releasing it, not clearing it away. It remains, pressing gently against everything within it. She moves to the next bed and continues. The same sequence unfolds, unchanged in structure, altered only in the smallest details. The cloth is placed, adjusted, removed. The hand steadies, lifts, steadies again. The movements do not accelerate or slow. They maintain a pace that exists independently of any external measure. You realize that there is no anticipation here, no waiting for a specific hour, no expectation of a shift that will bring change. The work does not lead toward a moment of relief. It sustains itself without reference to what might come next. The future does not enter the room. Only continuation does. At the edge of the space, the corridor remains present, its length unchanged, its light consistent, its doorways holding the same quiet variations of the same condition. The movement between room and corridor continues, but it does not alter the sense of time. It extends it, carrying the same continuity across different spaces without dividing it. She returns to the table once more. The objects remain where they were placed, though their arrangement has shifted slightly with each use. The water is darker now, its surface less reflective. The cloths are more worn, their edges less defined. The change is visible, but it does not mark time. It marks use. You begin to understand that time here is not counted. It is used, and once used, it does not return. The absence of markers does not create stillness. It creates a quiet drift, where moments do not anchor themselves to anything beyond what is immediately present. The room continues, but without edges that define its progression. You begin to feel how orientation slips, not suddenly, not in a way that disrupts perception, but gradually, as if the sense of before and after has been thinned until it no longer holds its shape. She moves between the beds again, the sequence unchanged. Her body no longer checks itself against anything outside the work. The movement is guided entirely by what is in front of her, by the next action required, by the continuation of a pattern that has replaced the need for external reference. The same gestures unfold, each one complete in itself, yet never concluding anything beyond its immediate function. You notice how the room no longer anticipates interruption. There is no expectation of a bell, no signal that would separate one period from another. Even the arrival of new bodies, once distinct, has folded into the same continuity. The door opens, the stretcher enters, the space adjusts, and the sequence resumes. The event does not divide time. It is absorbed into it. At the table, the cycle continues without pause. The cloths are taken, prepared, returned. The water darkens further, its surface holding less light with each repetition. The instruments maintain their position, though their edges have softened, their surfaces carrying the imprint of constant use. Nothing is refreshed. Everything persists, altered but still present. She lifts another piece of cloth and pauses for a fraction longer than before. The pause is small, but it carries a different quality. It is not uncertainty. It is recognition, not of the moment itself, but of its sameness with what has come before. The gesture holds, then releases, and the sequence continues as if the pause had not occurred. You begin to understand how memory shifts in this space. It does not organize itself into distinct events. It does not separate one moment from another with clarity. Instead, it blends, forming a continuous field where individual instances lose their edges. What remains is not a series of memories, but a general sense of having been within the same condition for longer than can be easily measured. She turns from the table and steps back into the room. The movement carries no sense of transition. It is part of the same flow that has been unfolding without interruption. The boundary between preparation and action, between one space and another, has softened to the point where it no longer defines anything clearly. From near the window, the light shifts again. It dims slightly, then steadies, then dims once more. The change is gradual, almost imperceptible, yet it marks something beyond the room, a cycle that continues outside, indifferent to what happens within these walls. Inside, the work does not respond. It maintains its own rhythm, separate, contained. You feel the distance between inside and outside widening, not in physical space, but in experience. The world beyond the window continues to move through its own patterns, while the room holds to its own continuity. The two do not align. They exist alongside each other without meeting. She reaches the far side of the room and turns again. The motion is the same, but it no longer carries any sense of repetition as something distinct. It is simply the next movement, the continuation of what is already in progress. The body does not mark it as something that has happened before. It performs it as something that must happen now. You begin to sense how the absence of markers alters perception itself. Without clear divisions, the mind does not separate, does not categorize. It remains within the flow, moving from one action to the next without stepping outside to observe it as a sequence. The experience becomes continuous, unbroken, held together by the persistence of the work. She pauses briefly at the edge of a bed. Her hand rests on the frame, the same gesture you have seen before, yet now it carries no reference to previous moments. It exists only in the present, without comparison, without measure. Then it lifts, and the movement continues. The room remains unchanged. The sequence holds, and time, no longer divided, continues to gather within it, unseen but constant. Decisions made in small measures. Decisions do not arrive as moments. They do not stand apart from the work, waiting to be recognized. They are woven into it, carried within the smallest actions, shaped by what is available and what is no longer possible. There is no space here for reflection that pauses the sequence. The choice is made within the movement itself, often without being named, guided by limits that have already been accepted. She stands at the table, her hand resting near two pieces of cloth. They are not the same. One is slightly thicker, its fibers still holding some strength. The other is thinner, its edges worn, its surface less capable of absorbing what it meets. The difference is small, but it is enough to matter. Her hand hovers briefly between them, not in hesitation, but in recognition of what each can offer. You watch as she selects one. The motion is quiet, almost indistinguishable from the other gestures that fill the room. There is no visible reasoning, no outward sign that a decision has been made. Yet the choice carries weight. It determines how the next action will unfold, how the material will meet the body it is meant to serve. The decision is not spoken. It is enacted. She turns and moves toward the beds. The cloth she carries now holds a different potential than the one she left behind. It will be used where it is needed most, not because it is sufficient, but because it is the closest approximation available. The sequence continues, shaped subtly by what has been chosen. You begin to notice how these choices are distributed across the room. They occur constantly, in ways that do not interrupt the flow of work. A hand reaches for one object instead of another. A movement is shortened to conserve strength. A task is completed in a slightly different order to accommodate what has changed. Each decision is small, but together they form a system that adapts without altering its structure. At the bedside, she begins the sequence again. The cloth is placed with care, its thickness allowing for a different kind of contact. Her hands adjust to it, the pressure slightly altered, the movement shaped by what the material can sustain. There is no visible acknowledgement of the choice that led to this moment. The work absorbs it, incorporating it into the pattern without distinction. Across the room, another figure reaches for an instrument. Their hand pauses briefly, then shifts to select a different one. The motion is subtle, but it carries the same quiet weight. The decision is made within the sequence, not outside it. The work continues, shaped by these adjustments that remain largely unseen. You begin to understand that there is no ideal outcome here. There is only what can be done within the limits that exist. The decisions do not aim for perfection. They aim for continuation. Each choice is measured against what is possible, not what is desired. The gap between the two has been accepted, folded into the structure of the work. She finishes at the bedside and steps back. Her hands lower slightly, then rise again as she turns toward the next task. The decision she made moments ago does not linger. It does not require confirmation. It has already been absorbed into the sequence, its effect carried forward without reflection. From near the doorway, a quieter movement draws your attention. A figure stands with their back to the room, their hands resting against the wall. Their posture suggests a pause that has extended slightly beyond the usual interval. When they turn, their movement is slower, as if the decision to continue has required more than the body readily offers. She does not move toward them. Her focus remains within the boundaries of what she can hold. The room does not allow for attention to extend beyond what can be sustained. Each person carries their portion of the work, their decisions contained within the limits of their reach. You begin to feel how these small measures shape the entire space. Nothing is decided in a single moment, yet everything is determined by the accumulation of these choices. The system does not announce its structure. It reveals itself through the continuity it maintains, through the way the work persists despite the limits that define it. She returns to the table. Her hand moves again between the available materials, selecting, adjusting, preparing. The sequence repeats, each iteration carrying its own quiet decisions, each one shaping what follows without breaking the flow. You understand now that there is no separation between action and judgment. The decision is the action, and the action continues, one small measure at a time. The weight of choosing does not appear all at once. It settles gradually, carried within the repetition of small acts that no longer present themselves as choices, but still require them. Each time her hand moves toward one object instead of another, something is decided. Each time her attention rests here and not elsewhere, something is left unattended. The pattern continues, but beneath it, these quiet divisions shape the direction of the work. She stands at the table again, the arrangement before her slightly altered. What was once placed in a clear sequence now carries the signs of continued use. The cloths are less distinct from one another, their differences more difficult to read at a glance. The water has darkened further, its surface no longer reflecting light in the same way. The instruments rest where they were returned, but their edges have softened, their surfaces bearing the accumulation of contact. You notice how the clarity of choice begins to narrow. It is no longer a matter of selecting between clearly defined options. It becomes a matter of working within diminishing distinctions. The materials do not present themselves as separate possibilities. They form a continuum, each one slightly more or less capable than the next, but none fully sufficient. Her hand moves across them, not hesitating, but adjusting. It folds differently, absorbs differently, requires adjustment that did not exist before. The work adapts, not by changing its form, but by compensating within it. Across the room, another figure completes a similar sequence. Their movements mirror hers, though the details differ. The choices they make follow the same logic, shaped by the same limitations. There is no coordination between them, yet the system holds. Each person carries their own set of decisions, and together they form a continuity that persists without central direction. You begin to feel how the accumulation of these choices alters the atmosphere. The arrival does not disrupt the pattern. It extends it, adding another point where decisions will be required, where the sequence will continue to unfold within the same constraints. She turns toward it without changing her pace. Her attention shifts just enough to incorporate what is coming, then settles again into the established rhythm. The work does not expand to meet the new demand. It redistributes itself, adjusting within the limits that already exist. You notice how the system does not resolve the tension it carries. It holds it. Each decision made within the room does not eliminate uncertainty. It contains it, allowing the work to continue without fully addressing what cannot be resolved. The accumulation of these contained uncertainties becomes part of the structure itself. She reaches the stretcher and begins the sequence once more. The cloth is placed. The body is adjusted. The pattern repeats, each action shaped by the choices that preceded it, each movement carrying forward what has already been decided. You begin to understand that the weight of these decisions does not disappear. It remains within the work, carried forward, shaping what comes next without ever fully revealing itself. And still, the sequence continues. Not because the decisions have become easier, but because they can no longer be avoided. The quiet reach of hunger. Hunger does not arrive as a single moment. It spreads slowly, entering the body without announcement, settling into it until it becomes difficult to remember what absence felt like before it was present. At first, it is a sensation, an emptiness that can be recognized, acknowledged, set aside. But here, within these walls, it has moved beyond that. It has become a condition, something that remains whether it is noticed or not, shaping the body from within. A step that once flowed into the next now pauses briefly before continuing. The difference is slight, but it is enough to be felt within the continuity of the space. You sense how hunger alters time within the body. It stretches the interval between intention and action, creating a subtle delay that accumulates over repeated movements. The sequence remains intact, but it unfolds at a pace that is shaped by what the body can sustain, not by what the work demands. She turns from the table and moves toward the beds. The cloth in her hand is held with care, its weight barely noticeable, yet still requiring attention. Each movement is accompanied by the quiet negotiation of energy, by the need to sustain effort without the support that once made it easier. From near the window, the light remains unchanged. It offers no indication of time passing, no signal that would allow the body to orient itself beyond the immediate task. The outside continues its own cycle, but it does not enter here in a way that alters what happens within the room. She steps back from the bed and turns. The motion is controlled, but the pause that follows is slightly longer than before. Her hands lower, then rest briefly against each other, fingers pressing together as if to maintain contact, to hold something steady that cannot be seen. The pause ends. The sequence resumes. You begin to understand that hunger here is not a moment to be endured. It is a condition to be carried, and it will remain, shaping the body in ways that do not announce themselves, but are present in every movement that continues despite it. Hunger settles deeper than sensation. It moves past the surface of the body, past the place where it can be named, and enters the rhythm of movement itself. What was once a signal becomes a background condition, present in every action without needing to be acknowledged. The body does not respond to it in a single way. It adjusts continuously, redistributing effort, narrowing movement, conserving what cannot be replaced. She moves again between the beds, her steps aligned with the same narrow paths. The distance does not change, but the way it is crossed does. Each step lands with careful precision, not only to avoid obstacles, but to preserve balance with the least possible effort. The floor feels slightly farther away, as if the act of placing weight upon it requires more attention than before. Still, the movement continues, contained within the same steady rhythm. You notice how her breathing has changed. It is quieter, more controlled, as if each breath must be measured against what the body can sustain. There is no visible strain, no break in the sequence, but the breath does not expand as fully as it might have once done. It remains close, contained, moving in a pattern that mirrors the restraint of her actions. At the bedside, she begins the sequence once more. The cloth is placed, adjusted, held in position with the same care as before. Yet there is a slight delay between each movement, a fraction of time that has stretched just enough to be felt. The hands remain precise, but the effort required to maintain that precision has deepened. It is not visible in a single gesture. It is present in the accumulation of them. Across the room, another figure pauses longer than the others. Their hand rests against the frame of a bed, not moving, not withdrawing. The pause extends, not into rest, but into a moment where the body seems to gather itself before continuing. Then, without any visible shift, the movement resumes, the sequence restored as if the pause had not occurred. You begin to understand how hunger alters the boundaries of endurance. It does not stop the work. It narrows the margin within which the work can continue. Each action must be carried with greater care, each movement aligned with what remains of strength. The system holds, but it does so within tighter limits. She steps back and turns, her gaze moving briefly across the room. The motion is small, contained, just enough to register the state of the space without breaking the flow of her work. The information is taken in and absorbed, shaping what comes next without requiring reflection. From the corridor, the faint sound of movement returns. Another stretcher, another arrival, the same pattern extending into the room without altering its structure. The door opens, the cold enters, the space adjusts. The sequence continues, incorporating the new presence without pause. She does not move toward it immediately. Her attention remains with the task in front of her, completing what has already begun before shifting to what is coming. The order is not arbitrary. It is shaped by necessity, by the understanding that interruption cannot be allowed to fragment the sequence. You feel how the room holds this balance, between what is present and what is arriving, between what can be done and what must be left. Hunger does not change this balance. It tightens it, reducing the margin for error, narrowing the space within which the work can unfold. She finishes at the bedside and moves toward the table. The cloth in her hand is returned, its condition altered once more. It joins the others, each carrying the trace of what it has been used for, each prepared to return again despite its diminishing state. At the table, her hand moves across the materials. The motion is slower now, not in hesitation, but in the need to recognize what remains usable. The distinctions are less clear. The choices are narrower. Still, the sequence continues, guided by what can be sustained. You begin to see how hunger does not stand apart from the work. It is woven into it, shaping each decision, each movement, each moment of continuation. It does not demand attention. It does not announce itself. It remains. And within that presence, the work continues, carried forward by bodies that no longer move despite hunger, but with it. When the room stops resisting. There is a point where resistance fades without being noticed. It does not happen suddenly. It does not declare itself as a change. It arrives gradually, through repetition, through the quiet acceptance of what once stood apart. What was once difficult becomes familiar. What once required effort becomes the way things are done. The room does not become easier. It becomes known. She moves through the space with the same measured pace. Her steps follow the same paths, her hands the same sequences, her attention the same shifting points. Nothing has been reduced. Nothing has been resolved. And yet, something has changed in how the body meets what is before it. The movement no longer pushes against the condition. It moves within it. You begin to notice how the atmosphere has settled. The sounds are the same, the quiet friction of cloth, the soft contact of hands against surfaces, the restrained rhythm of breath, but they no longer stand out as separate elements. They merge, forming a continuous background that does not call attention to itself. The room does not resist these sounds. It holds them. At the bedside, she begins the sequence again. Her hands move with a steadiness that no longer reveals the effort behind it. The adjustments are made with the same care, the same precision, but the tension that once accompanied them has softened. It has not disappeared. It has been absorbed into the movement itself. You sense how the body has adapted, not by becoming stronger, but by reducing what it expects from itself. The range of motion narrows slightly. The pace aligns more closely with what can be sustained. The gestures become more economical, each one shaped to require the least possible effort while maintaining the structure of the work. Across the room, the same pattern unfolds. Figures move between beds, their actions aligned without coordination, their sequences mirroring one another in quiet repetition. The room holds these movements without interruption, without variation that would break the continuity. What once might have felt like strain now settles into the background, part of the environment rather than separate from it. She steps back and turns. The motion is unchanged, but it carries no sense of adjustment. The body no longer negotiates each movement in the same way. It has already adjusted. The sequence continues, not because it has become easier, but because it no longer encounters resistance. You begin to understand how normalization takes hold. It does not alter the condition. It alters the relationship to it. The room remains as it is, crowded, dim, sustained by limited materials and constant effort. But the perception of it shifts. The edges soften. The distinctions between what is expected and what is endured begin to blur. At the table, the cycle continues. The cloths are prepared, returned, prepared again. The water darkens, yet it is still used. The instruments remain in place, their wear no longer drawing attention. What once might have signaled deterioration now passes without notice, integrated into the pattern of use. She lifts another piece of cloth and unfolds it. The motion is fluid, unbroken. There is no pause to assess its condition in the way there once was. The evaluation has become internal, immediate, no longer requiring visible attention. The decision is made within the movement, and the sequence continues. From the corridor, the familiar rhythm of arrival repeats. The door opens. The cold enters. The space adjusts. The stretcher is guided into place. The pattern extends, not disrupted, not altered. The room receives what comes without resisting it. You feel how the boundary between change and continuity dissolves. What arrives is no longer experienced as new. It is recognized as part of what already exists. The sequence absorbs it, extending itself without needing to reconfigure. She moves toward the stretcher and begins again. The same actions, the same measured attention. Nothing stands apart. Everything belongs. What once required acknowledgement now passes without it. The arrival of a body, the absence of movement, the subtle shift in breath, these no longer register as distinct moments that demand attention beyond the sequence itself. They are recognized, but not held. The room does not pause to observe them. It continues, incorporating each change into the pattern that has already formed. She stands beside the stretcher, her hands moving through the familiar sequence. There is no visible adjustment to account for what lies before her. The body is received in the same way as the others, the cloth placed, the position aligned, the boundaries re-established. The actions do not slow, do not hesitate. They unfold with a quiet certainty that comes not from confidence, but from repetition that no longer encounters resistance. You begin to notice how perception itself has shifted. Details that once stood out, the difference in weight, the variation in condition, the subtle changes in response, are still present, but they no longer draw focus in the same way. They exist within the field of awareness, but they do not separate themselves from it. The room is no longer composed of distinct elements. It has become a continuous surface. She steps back and turns, her movement unbroken. There is no pause to consider what has been done. There is no moment that marks completion. The sequence flows into the next action, carried forward by the same quiet momentum that has sustained it from the beginning. Across the room, the same continuity holds. Figures move between beds, their gestures aligned, their attention distributed across the space without interruption. The system functions without visible coordination, each part reinforcing the others, each movement contributing to the whole without standing apart from it. You feel how the room has settled into itself. The tension that once defined it has not disappeared. It has been absorbed, diffused across the surface of the experience until it no longer presents as something separate. What remains is a steady, unbroken field of activity, held together by repetition and the quiet acceptance of what cannot be changed. At the table, The cycle continues without variation. The cloths are prepared and returned, their condition no longer evaluated in the same way. The water is used despite its state. The instruments are handled with the same care, though their edges have softened. Nothing is questioned. Everything is used. She reaches for another piece of cloth and unfolds it. The motion is immediate, fluid, requiring no visible assessment. The body has learned to recognize what is needed without pausing to consider it. The decision is embedded within the action, inseparable from it. From the corridor, another arrival passes into the room. The door opens, the cold enters, the stretcher is guided into place. The sequence extends, unchanged. The event does not register as an interruption. It is part of the pattern, another point along the continuous surface of the work. She moves toward it without altering her pace. Her attention shifts, but it does not break. The sequence continues, incorporating the new presence without requiring adjustment beyond what has already been internalized. You begin to understand how normalization completes itself. It does not remove difficulty. It removes the distinction between difficulty and routine. What once stood apart as something to be endured now exists as the way things are. The room does not resist its condition. It holds it. She finishes at the stretcher and turns again. The motion is the same as before, yet it no longer carries any sense of repetition. It is simply the next action, the continuation of what has no clear beginning or end. The light at the window shifts slightly, though it does not change the room. Outside continues. Inside continues. The two no longer need to align. You remain within the space, watching as the sequence unfolds without interruption, without variation that would break its continuity. There is no moment that stands apart. No action that signals change. Only the steady movement of bodies within a room that no longer resists what it has become. When less can be done. There is a point where the work does not expand to meet what is needed. It narrows instead, not by design, but by necessity. The sequence remains, the structure intact, but what can be done within it begins to reduce. The gestures become smaller. The time given to each action shortens. The attention, once able to rest a moment longer, moves more quickly between points. Nothing is abandoned. It is condensed. She stands at the edge of a bed, her hands moving through the familiar sequence. The cloth is placed, adjusted, held for a moment. Then the motion ends sooner than it once did. Not abruptly, not carelessly, but with a quiet recognition that more cannot be given here without taking from somewhere else. The decision is not visible. It is carried within the timing of the action. You begin to notice how the sequence changes without altering its form. The same steps occur, but they occupy less space within the moment. Each action completes itself more quickly, not because it requires less attention, but because attention must be distributed more widely. The room holds more than it can sustain, and so the work adapts by narrowing what it offers. She steps back and moves to the next bed. The transition is immediate. There is no lingering, no extension of the previous task. The body moves forward, guided by the need to continue, to reach the next point where something can still be done. The sequence does not pause. It compresses. Across the room, the same pattern unfolds. Figures move more quickly now, though not in haste. The pace has shifted, not toward urgency, but toward efficiency shaped by limitation. Each movement carries less time within it, yet it maintains the same structure, the same care, the same quiet precision. You sense how the room holds more than before. There is no pause to smooth its edges, no moment to assess its condition beyond what can be seen instantly. The evaluation has been compressed into the movement itself. The decision is made as the cloth is lifted, not before. You begin to understand how limitation reshapes the experience of time. It does not slow the work. It reduces the time available within each action. The sequence continues, but it occupies a smaller portion of the moment, leaving less space for variation, for adjustment, for anything beyond what is immediately necessary. She turns and returns to the beds. The cloth in her hand is used as soon as she reaches the bedside, the sequence unfolding with the same precision, but with less extension. The hands move quickly, yet without haste, guided by a familiarity that allows them to complete the action without delay. From the corridor, another arrival enters. The door opens, the stretcher is brought in, the space adjusts. There is no pause to receive it. The sequence extends, incorporating the new presence immediately, without altering its pace. She does not look toward it at first. Her attention remains with the task in front of her, completing what can still be done before moving on. The order is maintained, not because it is ideal, but because it is necessary to prevent the sequence from breaking. You feel how the room tightens around the work. The space between actions narrows. The distance between tasks shortens. The margin for hesitation disappears. What remains is a continuous flow of movement, each action following the last with little space between them. She finishes at the bedside and moves on. There is no pause, no extension, only continuation, shaped now by what can no longer be given. What remains to be done no longer fits within the time available for it. It does not present itself as an excess that can be measured or reduced in clear terms. It exists as a quiet pressure, a sense that each action carries more within it than can be fully addressed. The sequence continues, but it does so under a condition where completion is no longer possible in the way it once was. She moves between the beds with the same measured pace. The rhythm has not changed, yet it carries a different weight. Each step leads directly into the next task, leaving no space to extend beyond what is immediately required. The hands move with precision, but the duration of each gesture has shortened, the contact maintained only as long as it can be sustained without disrupting what must follow. You begin to notice how attention divides more sharply. It does not linger. It does not return to what has just been done. It moves forward, carried by the necessity of what comes next. The body does not hold the previous action in memory as something to be completed. It releases it as soon as it ends, allowing the sequence to continue without interruption. At the bedside, she begins the sequence again. The cloth is placed, adjusted, removed. The motion is fluid, controlled, yet it resolves more quickly than before. There is no visible hesitation, no sign of uncertainty. The reduction is not in care, but in time. The action remains intact, but its span has narrowed. Across the room, another figure moves in the same pattern. Their hands mirror the same sequence, their movements aligned with the same compression. The body does not resist this compression. It adapts, narrowing its range, aligning itself with a reduced space within which it must operate. From near the doorway, a stretcher is placed into the room. The movement is absorbed instantly. There is no visible adjustment to accommodate it. The sequence extends, incorporating the new presence without altering its pace or structure. The room does not expand. It tightens further. She moves toward it, her attention shifting just enough to include what has arrived. The transition is seamless. The task before her is completed, then released, and the next begins without delay. The cloth is placed. The position is adjusted. The sequence unfolds within the same narrowed span. You begin to understand how the work continues even as it reduces. It does not stop when less can be done. It reshapes itself around that limitation, maintaining its form while altering its depth. The actions remain recognizable, but they no longer hold the same capacity. They carry what they can, and no more. She finishes at the stretcher and steps back. The motion is controlled, contained. There is no sign that anything is incomplete, though you sense that much has been left unaddressed. The sequence does not acknowledge this. It continues, moving forward without returning to what has passed. At the table, the cycle persists. The cloths are taken and returned more quickly. The water is used without pause. The instruments are handled with the same care, though their use has become more immediate, less extended. The system holds, but it does so within a reduced space. You begin to feel how the room no longer aims to resolve what it holds. It maintains it. Each action contributes to that maintenance, not by completing what is needed, but by sustaining what can still be carried forward. She turns once more, her movement aligned with the same sequence. The work continues, not as it once did, but as it must now. And within that continuation, the understanding settles quietly. There is more than can be done. Her steps follow the same narrow paths, her hands the same measured sequence, her attention shifting across the same points of need. Nothing in her movement suggests that something else is coming. There is no preparation for change. The body has aligned itself fully with what is present. You begin to notice how stillness has taken on a different meaning. It no longer suggests pause or rest. It exists within the movement itself, in the spaces between gestures, in the brief moments where the body holds position before continuing. These moments do not extend. They do not offer relief. They are part of the sequence, absorbed into it without distinction. At the bedside, she begins again. The cloth is placed, adjusted, removed. The hands remain steady, the motion precise, though the span of each action remains reduced. The work continues in the same narrowed form, unchanged in structure, sustained through repetition that no longer seeks variation. Across the room, the same pattern holds. Figures move in alignment, their gestures mirroring one another, their attention distributed across the space without interruption. The system persists, not because it is effective in the way it once might have been, but because it is all that remains. You feel how expectation has withdrawn. There is no sense of waiting for a moment that will bring difference. The arrival of new bodies does not signal escalation. The absence of movement does not signal conclusion. Each condition is absorbed into the same continuity, held within a structure that does not expand or resolve. She steps back and turns. The motion is the same as before, but it carries no sense of progression. It does not lead toward anything beyond the next action. The sequence unfolds without direction, sustained by necessity alone. From the corridor, the familiar rhythm of movement continues. The door opens, the stretcher enters, the space adjusts. The pattern extends, unchanged. The event does not alter the atmosphere. It reinforces it. She does not pause to receive it. Her attention remains where it is needed in the moment, completing what can be done before moving on. The order is maintained, not because it leads to a better outcome, but because it allows the sequence to continue without breaking. You begin to understand how the absence of change becomes its own condition. It shapes the way the room is experienced, the way the work is carried out, the way the body moves within it. The repetition no longer suggests that something will be different. It confirms that it will not. At the table, the cycle continues. The cloths are prepared and returned, their condition no longer drawing attention. The water is used despite its state. The instruments remain in place, they were integrated into their function. Nothing is restored. Everything is sustained. She reaches for another piece of cloth and unfolds it. Held in place by the quiet understanding that nothing is coming to alter it. What remains begins to feel complete, not because it has resolved, but because nothing stands outside it. The room holds everything within its boundaries, the movement, the stillness, the arrivals, the absences. There is no sense of something missing that might return to alter the balance. The pattern has closed around itself, forming a continuity that no longer refers beyond what is present. She moves through this continuity without interruption. Her steps follow the same lines, her hands the same sequence, her attention the same measured shifts. The work does not present itself as something that will end. It exists as something that continues, self-contained, sustained by repetition that no longer anticipates change. You begin to notice how perception narrows, not in a way that reduces awareness, but in a way that focuses it entirely within the room. The details that once might have suggested difference, the subtle variations in movement, the slight changes in condition, remain visible, but they no longer draw attention as markers of change. They are part of the surface, not distinct from it. At the bedside, she begins again. The cloth is placed, adjusted, removed. The sequence unfolds with the same precision, the same reduced span, the same quiet continuity. There is no moment that stands apart. Each action flows into the next without pause, without emphasis. Across the room, the same alignment holds. Figures move in parallel, their gestures synchronized not by intention, but by the shared structure of the work. The system persists, not because it is directed, but because it has become the only way movement occurs within this space. You feel how the room has settled into a state that does not require interpretation. It does not present itself as something to be understood or explained. It exists as a condition, complete in its continuity, held together by the actions that sustain it. There is no need to look beyond it for meaning. The meaning is in the persistence itself. She steps back and turns. The motion carries no sense of transition. It is not a movement from one phase to another. It is the continuation of what has already been established, repeated so many times that it no longer registers as repetition. From the corridor, the familiar sequence extends again. The door opens, the cold enters, the stretcher is brought in. The room adjusts without altering its pattern. The event does not stand apart. It is absorbed, becoming part of the continuous surface that defines the space. She moves toward it without hesitation. Her attention shifts seamlessly, her hands ready to begin the sequence again. There is no sense that this is something new. It is recognized as part of what is already known. You begin to understand how the absence of change becomes a form of stability. Not a stability that brings comfort, but one that holds the structure in place. The room does not need to adapt to something different. It continues as it is, sustained by the repetition that has defined it from the beginning. At the table, the cycle persists. The materials move through the same pattern, their condition altered but no longer noted as change. The water remains dark. The cloths remain worn. The instruments remain in use. The system holds, not by restoring what has been lost, but by continuing with what remains. She reaches for another piece of cloth. The motion is immediate, unbroken. Not in a way that breaks suddenly, not in a way that draws attention from across the room, but in small exposures that begin to appear within the movement itself. What was once held beneath the surface, fatigue, hunger, strain, begins to show, not as interruption, but as part of the sequence that can no longer be fully concealed. She moves between the beds as she has before. The same measured pace, the same narrow paths, the same sequence unfolding through her hands. But now, the signs are present in ways that do not withdraw as quickly as they once did. The pause at the edge of a bed holds a fraction longer. The hand that steadies itself against a surface rests there just slightly beyond the moment required for balance. Across the room, another figure leans more heavily against the frame of a bed. The posture is similar to what you have seen before, but it does not resolve as quickly. The weight remains for a moment longer, the body held in place not by choice, but by necessity. Then, slowly, the movement resumes, the sequence re-established without acknowledgement. You sense how the room absorbs these exposures. They do not disrupt the pattern. They do not draw focus away from the work. They are integrated, becoming part of the environment in the same way as every other condition that has been carried within it. She steps back and turns, her movement slightly delayed. The movement is the same, yet it holds a different weight, one that is now visible in the way the body sustains itself within it. You begin to understand how endurance reaches its limit not by breaking, but by revealing. The body does not stop. It shows. And within that showing, the sequence continues, carrying forward what can no longer be hidden. What becomes visible does not ask to be seen. It appears within the movement, carried by it, and remains there without drawing the room away from its pattern. The exposure is quiet, contained within the same gestures that have defined the work from the beginning. Nothing is announced. Nothing is set apart. The sequence continues, now holding what it once concealed. She stands beside the stretcher, her hands moving into place. The cloth is lifted, unfolded, positioned with the same measured care. Yet the motion carries a slight wavering, not enough to disrupt the action, not enough to alter its outcome, but enough to reveal the effort required to maintain its precision. The correction follows immediately, the sequence restored, the movement continuing as if it had not faltered. You begin to notice how the body compensates more frequently. The hand adjusts its grip. The wrist shifts its angle. The posture realigns itself within the space. These adjustments occur within the flow of action, not interrupting it, but shaping it. You begin to understand how endurance changes when it can no longer remain hidden. It does not weaken the structure. It becomes part of it. The work continues, but it now includes the effort required to sustain it, not as something separate, but as something embedded within every movement. At the table, the cycle persists. Her hand reaches for a piece of cloth, the motion slightly slower, the evaluation slightly longer. The material is selected, prepared, returned to use. The sequence holds, though it now reveals more of what it demands. You remain within the room, watching as the pattern continues. There is no break, no moment where the body is allowed to step outside what it carries. Only the steady continuation of movement that now shows, in small and quiet ways, what it takes to remain. And still, it remains. When the sequence outlasts the self. There is a point where the sequence no longer depends on the individual who carries it. It continues through them, but it is no longer held by them in the same way. The pattern has been repeated so many times, across so many moments, that it exists independently of any single body. What each person does remains necessary, but the structure itself no longer belongs to any one of them. Yet there is a sense that the body is being carried forward as much as it is carrying itself, sustained by the continuity of the work rather than by its own reserves. At the bedside, the sequence begins again. The cloth is placed, adjusted, held. The hands move with care, though the effort required to maintain that care is now fully visible in the slight wavering, in the controlled corrections that follow each movement. The action completes itself, not because it has become easier, but because it must. Across the room, another figure pauses. Their body leans against the edge of a bed, the weight held there for a moment longer than before. The pause extends, not into rest, but into a space where the movement has not yet resumed. Then, quietly, the sequence continues, the body returning to alignment with a pattern that does not stop. You begin to understand how the individual begins to dissolve within the continuity, not in identity, but in function. The work remains. The pattern persists. The bodies that carry it move within it, sustained by it, even as their capacity to hold it independently diminishes. She steps back and turns. The motion is slower, the transition more deliberate, yet it follows the same path, the same structure. The body does not leave the sequence. It remains within it, carried forward by the repetition that has defined every moment. From the corridor, the familiar movement enters again. And within that persistence, something settles quietly. The sequence does not end when the body weakens. It continues. Epilogue. After the silence returns. The city breathes again, though not in the way it once did. Snow still gathers along the edges of buildings, but it no longer settles against the same silence. The streets carry movement now, slow at first, uncertain, as if relearning how to hold the weight of footsteps after so long without them. The air shifts differently. It moves through open spaces where doors no longer remain closed, where windows no longer hold the same distance between inside and outside. The building remains. Its walls stand as they did, its windows still catching the pale light of winter, its corridors extending in the same quiet lines. From the outside, little has changed. The structure holds its shape, its presence steady within the city that begins to move around it once more. Inside, the rooms are no longer filled in the same way. The beds remain, but the density has lifted. The air moves more freely, no longer held in place by the constant presence of bodies. The sounds that once defined the space, the measured steps, the quiet adjustments, the restrained breath, have receded, leaving behind a different kind of stillness. You walk through the corridor now, not as a witness to movement, but as a presence within absence. The doorways still open into familiar spaces, but what they reveal has changed. The arrangement remains, yet the rhythm that once held it together has quieted. The sequence that moved continuously from one moment to the next has come to rest, not through resolution, but through cessation. In one of the rooms, light falls across the table. The surface is still worn, the edges still marked by use. The objects that remain carry the same signs of what they have endured: cloth that has been folded and unfolded beyond its original form, instruments that have lost their sharpness, water that once held more than it could reflect. They rest now, no longer moving through the cycle that sustained them. You stand for a moment, observing what remains. There is no clear boundary between what has ended and what continues. The space holds both. The absence of movement does not erase what occurred here. It reveals it in a different way, allowing the traces to settle into the surfaces, into the air, into the memory of the place itself. Outside, the city continues to change. Footsteps become more certain. They remain in the spaces where they occurred, steady and silent, long after the world has begun to move again. You've been part of echoes of war, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still